Just tell me when. Good afternoon, everybody. Good afternoon. Welcome, everybody, to Medical Grand Rounds. It's wonderful to see so many people here in person, including many of my chair colleagues from other departments. So this is an honor of our speaker today, Dr. John Carethers, who, as you all know, has been appointed as our next Vice Chancellor for Health Sciences, effective January 1, 2023. So thank you all for being here. He's currently chair of the Department of Medicine at the University of Michigan, where he's the C. Richard Boland Distinguished University Professor and John G. Searle Professor. Dr. Carethers earned his MD degree with high distinction from Wayne State University, completed residency in internal medicine at Mass General, followed by fellowship in gastroenterology in the research track at the University of Michigan. He was recruited to UCSD as his first faculty appointment, where he grew his lab-based research in the area of DNA mismatch repair and colorectal cancer pathogenesis, saw medicine and gastroenterology patients, and served as the main physician for hereditary colon cancer referrals in Southern California. He served in many leadership roles, including GI Fellowship Director, Section Chief at the VA, and then GI Division Chief here at UCSD. He's the founding director of the NIH-funded UCSD Gastroenterology Center Grant and was the director of the GI T32 Training Grant. At the University of Michigan, he has served for 13 years as chair of medicine, oversaw a $400 million plus annual budget, 930 faculty, which is more than I have, which is hard to believe, 1,000 plus departmental staff, and oversaw the integration of the department within the University of Michigan health system, which hopefully he'll teach us more about. His lab research continues to be funded by the NIH, and as somebody who's figuring out how to do that, kudos to John for doing that. And he has a strong interest in colorectal cancer disparities as it relates to genetics and outcomes. He's published over 200 manuscripts and book chapters, serves as a senior associate editor for gastroenterology, the highest impact GI journal. He completed a 2-year appointment on the National Commission for Digestive Diseases, a U.S. congressional commission to which he's appointed by Elias Zerhouni, then director of the NIH. In addition to this, I don't know when he actually sleeps, but he has served as president for both the Association of American Physicians and currently the American Gastroenterological Association. He's also done a tremendous amount of work in the area of disparities, serving as chair of the Minorities in Research Council of the AACR, developing and co-chairing programming for the Science of Cancer Health Disparities conferences, and contributing to AACR Cancer Health Disparities Report, and also mentoring a tremendous number of trainees, which I think is just as important as these committee services. He's an elected member of the National Academy of Medicine, and I'm sure you will all agree that he is an outstanding future Vice Chancellor, and we are happy to welcome him here today. So, John.
Thank you, Dr. Bork, for a kind introduction. It's great to be in San Diego. It's starting to get cold in Ann Arbor, so I keep that in mind as well. But thank you for such a warm welcome. And, you know, I've always been an absolute fan of UC San Diego, having been here and developed my own academic career here. And, you know, so I've always kept it in mind. And when this opportunity came, it was wonderful to put my name in and see how things would progress. So I hope I live up to your expectations in the next several years and really push UC San Diego to the level that we can absolutely achieve in the future. So I'm gonna, I was invited before all this happened. And so this is, you know, the timing of this was just unbelievable. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about early onset colorectal cancer, and this is some of my own view on how things progress, and this is going to have some aspects of showing racial disparities, and then how some of the guidelines were adjusted for that. And let me see if this is the one that moves ahead. This one? Not moving? Nope, not moving. Oh, there it goes. These are my disclosures, just NIH and University of Michigan funding. I'm on a scientific advisory board for a company called Genioscopy that they're working on a fecal test. And then I'm a non-executive board director of Avantor, which is not a pharmaceutical company, it's a life sciences company. So just to give you some background epidemiology, this is data from the American Cancer Society. And if you go back and look at the data for the last 40 or 50 years, and by race and ethnicity in the United States, African American or Black patients in the United States has always had the highest incident for colorectal cancer until this year, when Native Americans and Alaskan Natives actually took over that incident rate. That's just the first year in more than 40 or 50 years that American Indians have taken over that rate. The deaths are still highest among American Blacks. And if you look at incidence, the death rates are usually lag behind the incidence rate. So I would expect in the next probably 5 to 7 years that American Indian death rate would even surpass American Blacks. So high rates, and I want to point out that this is the first year that American Indians have overtaken that. I do also want to point out, and there was initially a limited data on this, you look at young onset, and there's very few studies on this, and I'll show you the death study coming up that's in press right now, that even at younger ages, it was higher in American Black patients. There's very little data, if any, on American Indian patients. This is a study that comes out from Caitlin Murphy's group at UT Houston, who looked at disparities in incidence and death for early onset colon cancer. So this is from 20 to 49 years. And non-Hispanic Blacks, again, had the lowest, this is survival, so mortality disparity. And if you look at the chart on the bottom right there, you'll see Blacks from 1992 to 2002 having, you see that dots just around age 55. And even in the orange, which was the second period from 2003 to 2013, there was some improvement, but still lagged behind other major racial and ethnic groups in the United States. Now, what is driving all this? And I started in the lab studying biology of colorectal cancer, but biology can be a consequence of things that happen to the person. And now the prevailing belief, and there's genetics that can drive, for instance, cancer, but the other piece is our environment. And environment tends to trump the somatic genetics because the somatic genetics are a result of the environment. And so the prevailing thinking now, and this is from a review I wrote, is that we're structured in the United States with lower socioeconomic status. Your zip code, where you live in, where you were born, will determine what happens to you down the line. And there's a lot of data on this. If you're born in zip code 1, in which there is high population density, low X parks, the attrition rate for education is much lower, socioeconomic opportunities are much lower, you're taking public transportation, those types of things. That's going to determine your risk for cancer down the line. And it determines if there's grocery store deserts there, you're getting high caloric, high dense, fast type foods, lower physical activity because you don't have park space, etc. And then those have metabolic consequences to yourself. You can alter your gut microbiome because you're feeding the gut microbiome a different thing. You can have localized inflammation. And then that can lead to colonic crypt proliferation and the chance for somatic mutations and the development of cancer as you age. And I'm going to show you a study by Steve O'Keefe that drives that home. But I will say that this diagram that I put in this review if I switch that last line for increased risk for colon cancer and put COVID, you would see the exact same thing. It's just on a much more faster scale. In colon cancer, it takes many years, of course. This is a study from Steve O'Keefe that I've always found very fascinating. What he did is he took a group of rural Africans and a group of African Americans, and he took pre and post rectal biopsies after doing diet manipulation. So he took a typical African American diet. This is southeast United States. I think it was North Carolina, South Carolina, where the food density was high caloric, classic westernized type of diet. And he took an African diet, which was legumes, grains, those types of things, and he swapped the diets between these two populations for just 2 weeks, which was amazing. On the left, you see the results of the pre-biopsy and the post-biopsy. So the first part shows Ki-67, a proliferation marker. So the African Americans who are now taking the rural African diet cut their level of proliferation, colonic proliferation, in half, whereas the Africans taking now the westernized diet doubled the rate of colonic cell proliferation. You look at the intestinal intraepithelial lymphocytes, or CD868, another macrophage inflammation marker. The level of inflammation on the rural African diet went down. This is just after 2 weeks, whereas the level of inflammation in the Africans taking the westernized diet went up. If you look at short-chain fatty acids, which is a normal colonocyte fuel for healthy colonocytes, the level of butyrate went up on the African Americans who were taking the more healthy rural African diet, and went down for the Africans taking the westernized diet. And secondary bile acids, which are modified by bacteria, some people think these are slightly procarcinogenic, and the opposite happened. So on the westernized diet, secondary bile acids went up, and on the rural African, it went down. So the bottom line is, just after 2 weeks, intervention switch, all these parameters changed. Now think about this for 40 years. And what's the risk of proliferation becoming dysplastic and then acquiring genetic changes and leading to cancer? So this was just after 2 weeks exchange. Also, if you look at, oops, let's go back here. If you look at data in the United States where a lot of the comorbid illnesses are, these are consequences of metabolic change. This is a study that came out during the middle of COVID, because these were the same people who were getting COVID symptoms and COVID infections. So if you look at 45 to 54, so around the age we start screening, American Blacks already had a higher vulnerability index. And if you look at 45, 64 or 65 plus, which are even the population that we screen in for colorectal cancer, American Blacks had many more higher frequency of the number of comorbid risk factors compared to other populations that can put them at a much higher risk. And again, this is probably changed from a lifetime input to cause those metabolic consequences. Back in 1997, colonoscopy was added to our repertoire for colon cancer screening. It had not yet been approved for screening by CMS until 2001. A lot of you don't realize 2001 was when colonoscopy was paid for screening. So if you look at the data from the National Polyp study that goes back to 1997 and before, and you compare that with the data, blacks versus whites in the United States, a lot of this was anecdotal, and some of it was from some of the SEER data and American Cancer Society data. If you look at this kind of this aqua colored dotted line, that was the age on the x-axis, colorectal cancer rate per 100,000 on the y-axis. There was an earlier age shift for those from black backgrounds in the United States compared to whites in the population, such that if you look at when the National Polyp study published their finalized stuff in 1997, about 95% of all colon cancer in the United States was after the age of 50. And that's why the age 50 was selected. Only about 5% were below that. And you can argue, this is before we knew any of the genetics of some of the high-risk syndromes, that they could have been high risk because you've heard of things like FAP and other things. Lynch syndrome, the genetics was not even, it was just starting to be figured out. But if you look at African Americans, it was about 10% below age 50. And then if you move that curve to the cutoff of 45, you bring it down to 5%. And so there was some advocacy for starting screening early in African Americans with some of this data as it came out. Now, colon cancer just don't come out of the blue. They usually start as precursor lesions, adenomas. So if you look at data from the Corey database from David Lieberman, who was funded for this, he did gigantic colonoscopy screening studies, and Kaiser Permanente, Doug Corley's group, they show that this is also true for precursor lesions, the adenomas. In Black patients, whether you're male or female, you had about 15% higher risk for adenomas of advanced pathology, which have a higher transgression record for turning into cancer. And I point out in Doug Corley's group, he showed Native Americans, and this study came out in 2013, already had higher levels of advanced adenomas back then, and now we're seeing the consequences of that in cancer from ACS data that just came out this year. The other thing that's present is proximal adenomas. So proximal adenomas, we know colonoscopy is the gold standard for screening patients, right, in the United States, even though that's not the only screening modality that's effective. But even that's our best test, but it still misses lesions, particularly on the right side of the colon. And there's data shown here, as well as cancer data, that there's a higher number of proximal adenomas, which are sometimes harder to find and easier to miss, to the tune in Black patients, 28% higher, and even in Native Americans, sometimes as high as 50% higher along those, compared to whites in the United States. So precursor lesions, not only they're more advanced, but some of them are more proximally located as well. Now, without going through a lot of other papers, I'm just going to, I just put this is from the review I wrote, and it just summarized a lot of things in the literature that shows some differences. So biological, increased risk of these high-risk adenomas, increased proximal, earlier age of onset, increased proximal cancers. There's some evidence, and some of this is anecdotal, about sulfidogenic bacteria, which is supposed to be more associated with certain types of colon cancer, and fusobacterium, which has been associated with advanced colon cancer. There's some genetic differences I'm not going to go through that. Some of them are one-off papers like the folliculin mutation. There's a consistent increased frequency of KRAS, which gives a higher risk cancer. There's data on immunologic differences. And then there's also screening differences. And I'll touch back on that a little bit later, where that gap had been closed or nearly closed pre-COVID, but I'm afraid that gap is widening since the COVID, because the recovery from getting people into screening is going to be different. At least the early data shows it's different between different groups in the United States. So why do I tell you all this? Well, because of all this data, some as early as 2001 had recommended moving earlier screening for this population, Black population, because of all this data. And you can see different groups that recommend either 40 or 45 to move that curve such that only about 5% were lower than age 50. But even though all these recommendations were out there for years, it was not until 2017, which is one of the more beefier recommended groups, the U.S. Multi-Society Task Force for Colorectal Cancer, recommends screening to age 45. They call it a B evidence for that. So it still didn't carry the full weight, because what carries the full weight is the U.S. Preventive Services Task Force, of which usually CMS follows those recommendations and allows payment. the authority to put that fully into practice. And so 2017, the Multi-Society Task Force recommended African Americans, but actually what happened was the American Cancer Society came out and says, well, we're seeing this increase in early onset cancer across the entire population. And then last year in 2021, they lowered the age to 45 for everyone, all Americans. So you did get African Americans who were affected by this, but because there was an increase in all populations, the recommendation is that all populations would start at age 45. So it's good. We're now seeing everyone getting screened. Of course, I don't know how it is here, but I'm sure there's wait lines because I added 18 million people to the screening pool in the United States. So, so my friends at Kaiser Permanente put out this paper, and I'm on this paper that's in press. They took the Multi-Society Task Force recommendation in 2017 and before the U.S. Preventive Services Task Force in 2021 and started screening Black patients under the age of 50, starting at age 45. And so this data just looked at what's the uptake for that. And they showed slightly less uptake for getting at least one order, in this case, a FIT test. And they had a slightly less uptake for having at least one FIT test completed. So ordering it and getting completed. But there was no difference between the percentage of abnormal FIT tests or the follow-up colonoscopy completion. And they're chalking this a little bit up to because it was a new recommendation. It wasn't across the board, and maybe not every primary care person who ordered this knew about the new recommendations. So there was a slightly lower uptick, but that's messaging and other things. Now, can this type of screening eliminate disparities? And the answer is yes. And this paper came out just earlier this year from Sheikh Debaney, and this was also Kaiser data. And they have been using FIT tests for the majority of their screening for a long time. And I know Stoney Anderson's here. He's at Kaiser, and that's been one of their mantras. You can opt for colonoscopy, but they've always done initially FOBT and then FIT. And this data shows that when you do FIT and you have adequate follow-up of colonoscopy, in a navigated system in Kaiser, you can eliminate the disparities for incidence and mortality. And it doesn't matter if it's early stage, late stage, or the overall incidence or direct deaths from colon cancer in a program like that. So this is one of the things that we as healthcare providers can certainly do. It's hard to change people's diets in the long run. It's hard to get them to take, their aspirin every day or whatever, but screening is a great equalizer. And there's also data that colonoscopy can do that as well, because that was the Delaware Cancer Consortium study. But even non-invasive screening can get rid of that disparity. And that's why this was in the New England Journal of Medicine. So I tell you that because the trends for early onset colon cancer have changed. The demographics have changed a lot. So I told you a lot of data on Black patients. Over the last 30 years, the number of cancers in white and Hispanic patients have also gone up to the point that they've reached the level of the high level that Black patients were already at. So now the burden of colorectal cancer moved from 5% 20, 30 years ago to now as high as 12%. 12% of all colon cancers in the United States now are under the age of 50. And up until this year, we didn't ever screen for them. And so you can see these lines taken from American Cancer Society here. This is a birth cohort effect. So this is not genetics. So if you were born before 1960, this doesn't happen. You're born after 1960, the levels go up. So by the time you start hitting age 30, so this was around 1990, so 30 years after 1960, you can see this change, this elbow in these age groups under the age of 50 going in the opposite direction that they historically had gone. So this is a birth cohort effect. So this is not genetics, as I said. This is not germline mutations that's driving this unless we've evolved that fast. Okay, so this is data summation from one of my colleagues, Elena Stoffel at the University of Michigan, plus some other papers. She analyzed, and others have done this too, like, okay, so all these young patients are coming up. What's the percent are actually driven by a genetic disease? And so the answer is only about 20% time you will find a known genetic disease under that. And you can see some of the high-risk genes listed there. They range from BRCA2 to some of the Lynch genes, et cetera. If you have a germline mutation, your outcome is going to be better. You're more likely to have a family history of colon cancer, and your survival is going to be better. So those are the ones that we should recognize and take out of that group. What we don't know is the other 80%, and that's what's been driving this increase. There's obviously no known mutated genes, because if they were, we'd figure that out. They tend to less likely to have a family history. They tend to be almost 3/4 to 4/5 of them are distal. These are rectal and sigmoid tumors compared to more proximal for some of the other germline. And many of them present at advanced stage. Now, are they advanced stage because it's more aggressive disease, or are they advanced stage because we never screened for them? That's another question. These are all microsatellite stable because they don't have germline mutations in any of the known Lynch genes that will give you microsatellite instability at all. So their outcome tends to be much worse than someone with a germline. And this is the group that we know very, very little about. So what in the environment changes our risk? And that's a big driver. And so there are a lot of examples of this historically. You know, prior to World War II, there were a lot of immigrants from the Asian Rim, Pacific Rim, to California, as an example. And within 2 generations, their rates of colorectal cancer jumped up to what it was in the United States when it was already low in Japan. We've also did the opposite experiment. We've exported everything from Taco Bell and Kentucky Fried Chicken to Tokyo, and some of their rates there have now gone up. Maybe they were more genetically susceptible, but you never saw it on a rice and fish-based diet. But once you put a westernized diet, boom, rates went up. If you look at what's happened in China, and in my position at the University of Michigan, we have some partnerships in China, and I've been to China multiple times, and I've seen them evolve from, you know, very little cell phone use and, you know, simple diets to now middle class and, you know, obesity and metabolic disease that has just grown tremendously in China. And this is because they have a growing middle class. But they're getting metabolic syndrome now, even at lower BMIs than we see in the United States. And this led to cardiovascular disease and the rates of cancer. Their absolute number of colon cancers, because their population is so much bigger, is much higher than in the United States now. Not percent-wise, but number-wise. And then we also see environmental changes by the things that we ingest. Things like aspirin and NSAIDs, we know that can lower our rate of colon cancer and recurrent colon cancer if you had colon cancer. You can lower your rate for colon cancer by 10 to 12% with adequate levels of vitamin D and calcium. Women who take hormone replacement therapy or are premenopausal have much lower rates, etc. And of course, dietary, as I showed you with the Steve O'Keefe study, are another examples of changing the environmental risk, but that's very hard to do. So why is there increase in early onset? Are these the same drivers that I pointed out to you in African Americans or Native Americans, or it's different? Keep in mind, there's a bigger risk for proximal cancers in African Americans, and these have been distal. So I'm not sure they're the exact same thing, but maybe we can learn from them. What are the modifiers? I mean, we think of the diet and microbiome and all these things that we could take or prevent. And then I pointed out that we don't screen, up until this past year, we didn't screen anyone under age 50. And so screening utilization rates weren't the driver either, of course. So the way I think of early onset colon cancer is it's got to be an environmental driver. I mean, I don't think there's any question about that. Now, what could be the scenario for that? Could something in the environment, hit people, and then we historically screen people over age 50, didn't screen people under age 50. The screening, we see a reduction, but the people who we didn't screen, there's a apparent relative increase because we're getting rid of all the cancers over the age 50. Or is it something in an environment that just affects everyone, and but it affects young individuals or maybe the developing colon differently than an age colon, and then there's a true increase in that. And these are hypothetical because we don't know the answer. So what could be some of the key drivers out there? And the biggest evidence points to metabolic disease. So what are some of the metabolic drivers? And I'm just pulled a couple papers from the literature. One is this thing, your favorite thing called high fructose corn syrup. Now, it turns out that big orange piece of the pie is the United States. We're the biggest producer and user of high fructose corn syrup. Now, some of this early onset colon cancer has gone up in many Western populations. But you really see it in the United States, and it's in a lot of products. So what is high fructose corn syrup? I have to look this up because I don't deal with this every day. It's glucose fructose, and it's converted from cornstarch. That's why it's called high fructose corn syrup. And they enzymatically convert this from glucose to fructose. Very cheap, easy to use, and it's very sweet. And this is why they put it in products. They determine the type of high fructose corn syrup by the dry weight of it. So you see high fructose corn syrup 42 all the way down to 60 and higher. And some of the lower ones go into some non-sweetened, or at least non-diet sweetened sugary beverages. But some of the higher ones go into soft drinks, okay? Or jellies that are filled. And it's a big driver. I mean, 6 billion growing to, maybe almost 8 billion in just a couple of years. And it's even added to stuff that's not, I don't traditionally think as sweet. And it drives a lot of liver disease. I see Rohit in the audience as well. The interesting thing is we can handle glucose because we have specific transporters in the intestine. Fructose overwhelms those, and they get down to the colon. So there's a lot of, I'm not going to go through all the papers, but it might trigger inflammasome interaction, or it's certainly associated with metabolic syndrome, obesity, diabetes. And actually, as I said, 5 grams of fructose overwhelms our GLUT5 transporter. A lot of it gets down to the colon. What's it doing in the colon? Who knows? It's associated with NAFLD, as I mentioned. That's non-alcoholic fatty liver disease and colitis. So this is an interesting paper in Science just from a couple years ago, looking at high fructose corn syrup and developing colon cancer in mice. And they took APC mice. So this is, APC is the Adenomatous polyposis coli gene. And if you take that out, they can get polyps and can get cancer. And so they looked at, okay, here I got APC mice. Does high fructose corn syrup alter the development of these tumors in the mouse? And it clearly enhanced tumor growth independent of developing obesity in the mouse, okay? So you can see a lot more blue on the histology there. The total number of tumors in the mice went way up, and high-grade tumors went way up in those who got the high fructose corn syrup. And it's interesting because the tumor itself was using the fructose metabolically. And now, whether that helped to grow these, that's still unknown, but that's you can see the metabolic activity that the tumor was using from the high fructose corn syrup, which is fascinating. The other thing is what's epidemiology going on in humans. If you look at, this is a paper from Hassan Hussein, who's at Ohio State. And yes, we do talk to people at Ohio State from Michigan from time to time and work with them. Medically, they're okay. It's the football team that we always worry about. But if you look at the number of resections for adults with obesity, colorectal cancer resection is going up, meaning the incidence of colorectal cancer is still going up. But if you look at adults without obesity, historically, look at the number of resections for colon cancers have gone down. Either they're finding them at an earlier stage or they're happening less often, suggesting that this is tied to metabolic syndrome and obesity. at least from these types of observations. This is a fascinating model from Sweden that was just published 2 years ago in PLOS Med, showing that, so on the left is men, on the right is women, so I'll focus on the men right now because the graphs are pretty much the same. These are curves that look at the risk of colon cancer based on family history, presence or absence of diabetes. And on the most, let's see if this shows up here. So on this arrow, if you look at this curve, and they standardize it to age 50. So this is the male population, and you see the black line and the kind of the greenish hash line. No but diabetes without colorectal cancer family history, and that's usually the age we historically start screening. But it shifts by at least 5 years earlier in their model, and this is taken from actual patient data. If you have diabetes, okay, or family history. So they're saying here that if you have diabetes, your risk of getting colon cancer is the same as if you had a family history. That's pretty impressive. Family history is genetics. Diabetes is definitely environmental. And if you had both of these, you moved it way younger. And it's the same is true for women. But it tells you that, at least on this model, it tells you the power of the environment driving the risk factors. Is that the answer for young onset? Again, we don't know, but this is the most highly associated thing with early onset colon cancer is these metabolic consequences. Now, what about microbiome alterations? I mean, because the metabolic probably affects the microbiome, and I know there's a lot of people in the audience interested in the microbiome. This is a study from I think the Nursing Health Profession study from Sujio Gino's group at Harvard, where they were looking at particularly Fusobacter nucleatum because that has been associated with advanced neoplasia in the colon, and they show this was associated with a inflammatory type diet. They had this thing called EDIP, which is empiric dietary inflammatory pattern score, and it's a weighted intake of 18 foods instructed to give you this elevation of these pro-inflammatory cytokines. So you kind of are what you eat. And if you have this group, if you have this diet, and they looked at tertiles of this diet, particularly in the proximal colon, they showed that you were more likely to have a Fusobacterium tumor compared to anywhere else, but that was not true anywhere else in the colon. So I'm not sure this is the driver of early onset colon cancer, but it just tells you that the microbiome could be affected. Now, has anyone heard of this stuff called triclosan before? I'm gonna throw out a wild thing for you, and I hope no one walks out of here and says, okay, Carethers is crazy, but you're all probably gonna change your soaps after today. Triclosan is a compound that was started in the 1960s. Think about 1960 when our stuff started going up. It was used initially as a hospital scrub, kind of think of like betadine or alcohol, and then later got expanded consumer market. And companies use it as a marketing tool. So when you look at your soap and it says antimicrobial soap, and a soap that doesn't have it, are you more apt to buy the antimicrobial or the one without it? What would the audience say? Maybe the former rather than later. Perhaps, I don't know. So actually, there is no evidence, zero evidence, that one soap is better than the other. Okay, the FDA has put the kibosh on this, but it got into over 2,000 consumer products. It's on baby toys. It's impregnated on couches and furniture. It's on a lot of things. It's in some toothpaste, okay, besides soaps, okay? So, so by 2014, it was in over 2,000 consumer products, okay? These are some of the products it's been in, okay? And so this is I took this from the web. It says, oh, when you see this, this has been linked to some weird things. They're like, you should, so these groups were saying you should avoid this stuff, okay? They said safer options, wash your hands with soap and water at least 20 seconds, avoid products labeled antimicrobial or germ killing or whatever, and read labels to avoid just triclosan, because there's been some evidence for some of these things associated with this compound. Now, this is just one compound, so this is a hypothesis here, okay? So this has been added to a number of things. It's in some cosmetics, furniture, toys, as I mentioned. It's been associated with some endocrine imbalance and bacterial resist. The only benefit in the literature was there's a couple papers suggesting that it can reduce gingivitis. That's why I got into some toothpastes. So by September 2016, the FDA said, okay, you guys are just using this for marketing. There's no evidence. So they put the kibosh on it. They said, you will not be able to use triclosan in products without pre-market review due to insufficient data regarding any effectiveness of this thing. Okay, so that was 2016. So there's still products out there with it, but they can't get a review through. So now they're using other compounds that do that, but they can't put this one in. Now, why do I mention this? Well, because there's this fantastic study published in Science Translational Medicine. No one had ever studied this stuff. That's the fascinating thing. So it turns out we don't know much about it. It's a contaminant rivers, and 75% of us were peeing it out in our urine, meaning you were exposed to it, okay? This group decided, like, no one knows anything about this. Let's put this in mice and see what happens. So they decided to study this in mouse, and they use, they achieved the same serum concentrations that some of the human exposure, 10 and 80 parts per million, okay? Now, granted, most of the time, unless you're using toothpaste, you're probably absorbing it through your skin, but they did feed it to the mice, so that was the one difference. But no one had ever studied this until this paper that came out in 2018. So just by triclosan itself, nothing, these are just normal mice, okay? It causes, whether it's 10 or 80 parts per million, and so spleen weight means you've caused some inflammation and the spleen's reacting to that. The level of IL-6 went up, and the gene expression of IL-6 went up, and they get this mild colitis. For those GI people in the audience, how many times do you have a scope, you took some random biopsies, there's no microscopic colitis, but you had this random colitis, you're like, what the heck is this? And you're like, there's nothing you can do because you don't know what it is, right? So from your random biopsies, it could be this, who knows, okay? So it caused a mild colitis in these mice, okay? And you can see the histologic score, and you can see the inflammation in between the crypts. So they said, okay, we're gonna use a standard colitis model, DSS colitis, and we're gonna give triclosan. What happens then? The bottom line is it enhanced the colitis further. Okay, you can see at 80 parts per million, you almost don't recognize any crypts, and you see the histologic score. When the intestines inflame, the intestine shrinks, so it shrinks in size, and you can see the level of inflammatory cells, and markers went up, IL-6 went up, gene expression of IL-6 went up. And this was even true down to level of 5 and 10 parts per million. I'm sure the reviewers made them put the lower in there. That's why this is in there. So they had even a worse inflammation with just giving this compound in concentrations that you see in humans. So they said, okay, we see it in DSS, let's just use a knockout model. So they use a IL-10 knockout, and there's a standard way to doing that. And then they just gave triclosan versus not triclosan. And again, you see the level of inflammatory cells go up, and much worse inflammation and histology score, even on a genetic knockout model. And then, of course, now getting to the cancer question, okay, so they preconditioned these mice with an AOM DSS model, and this is a standard way of generating tumors in mice. And you can see that those who got triclosan compared to those who did not obviously had a worse survival, much more neoplasia in the colon. The tumor number of mouse went up, the average tumor size, and the volume went up. And you can see the level of beta-catenin, which is a pro-carcinogenic proto-oncogene, goes up. The level of proliferation by PCNA went up, etc. So just by adding triclosan to the model really drove not just inflammation, but pre-neoplasia and neoplasia. And you can see this even here, mostly shown at 8 and even 10 parts per million with inflammatory, pro-inflammatory cytokines, TNF, and gene expression as a result of that as well. So then I said, okay, we got all this stuff going on. Okay, what's happened to the microbiome? They looked at the microbiome diversity, and it changed the diversity. Remember, it's an antimicrobial, and that's what they labeled it as. They focused largely on this paper that showing that bifidobacterium, which is one of our, I'll say, good bacteria, really went down dramatically in that, giving the triclosan. And they showed that it altered inflammation because they used germ-free mice. So if you have germ-free, this really goes through the microbiota, no difference compared to the colon lymph shrinking, IL-6 going up, but no difference when it's in germ-free, etc. And the same thing for the histological score. They didn't have much change in histology in germ-free, but only in the conventional house mice did this really affect it. They said, okay, so we know it's through microbiota. Let's look at the TLR4, and exactly the same thing. We see activation of TLR4. The LPS in plasma goes up. 16S RNA for it goes up. The gut gets leaky, and you can see that particularly occludin is what drops in that mouse model. And then they show that this also enhances DSS colitis through TLR4 because they use TLR4 knockout mice. So I won't go through it in detail, but the bottom line is it was due TLR4. Okay, and clearly showed that it had to be present for you to get those changes. So in summary, from this fascinating paper, and no one ever tied this to early onset colon cancer, but just short-term exposure, this was after 2 or 3 weeks of this stuff. Inflammation, colitis-associated cancer, disrupts epithelial barrier and requires the gut microbiota. So my question to you, are there compounds like this and other compounds out there that is the environmental driver for early onset colon cancer? Now, I don't have an answer, but we should think about it, and someone should do a study on this. So again, I think of this as something in the environment is changing this. And whether that is a one-time exposure or ongoing exposure, like I reported with, triclosan, you're going to go through the tumor initiation and progression stage and get your genetic changes for that. But until we figure out what items, is it the metabolic driver? Is it an environmental exposure driver? We don't really know to date. This is kind of a summation. This is one of our graduating fellows who wrote this summary thing with me on just looking at all the things that are known out there. So we know it's birth cohort. We know the biggest risk factors now are metabolic syndrome. At least that's what's in the literature. Again, tying it perfectly to that is not quite there yet. Could there be other environmental exposure? Presentations delay. We don't screen typically for these. They tend to be a little more aggressive. The outcome is same but you can lose a large number of life years because they're such young. The pathogenesis, bottom line, is unknown, but possible link it to metabolic or some kind of direct exposure. And now what's known about the somatic changes? Very little, and these are, I'll say, more anecdotal than dogma. Maybe slight increase in P53 mutations over typical non-early onset cancers. A little bit of hypomethylation in line 1. Of course, there's no microsite instability, of course. Some of them have presence of chromosome instability or microsite and chromosome instability, or what they call MACs. Now, again, these are more anecdotal than dogma, but that's what's known out there. So this is a study that same fellow did with me, looking at data, trying to figure out, can we figure out any drivers? So if we can figure out the drivers, maybe you can backtrack to the exposures. So this is data where he looked at TGCA data set as well as another data set and showed, and we looked at several expressions, but we honed in on this one, ALDH1, which is in the retinoic acid metabolism pathway. And we showed that it was increased in both colon and rectal cancers, human colon rectal cancers. The expression was much higher amongst the early onsets. But again, this is in press right now. But again, we don't know why that is right now. And there are other people looking at metabolic changes and microbiome change. So just to kind of close on this, so to make full circle, back in 1997, as I said, colonoscopy was recommended as a screen tool for all persons. It wasn't paid by CMS until 2001, okay? But because of the epidemiology, several organizations, the American College of Gastroenterology, American College of Physicians, other organizations, I recommend African Americans be screened at either 45 or 40, but it didn't become the dogma because U.S. Preventive Services Task Force didn't do it. And then finally, one of the bigger societies said, oh, we should probably do that 2017. So you can see how many years passed for this. And in 2018, the American Cancer Society, because of the increase in early onset, started going up and said, all average persons should do this. And finally, the U.S. Preventive Services Task Force, which really drives the payment, suggested to all average risk patients, which we started doing that just this past year. So that's the timeline and the reason why I gave you all that background. So we still don't know exactly what drives African American, but I suspect that it is the socioeconomic and metabolic. But what is driving everyone else recently, we don't know. And if you have an answer to that, I'll be happy to talk with you. So I'll stop there.
Thank you, John, for a tour de force. We have, should we start with questions here? We have some Zoom questions as well. Sylvia.
Okay. Nice to use the microphone again. It is so excellent presentations. Thank you so much for sharing amazing data. So two comments. One is in our department, Bob Tukey. He's working on triclosan in the context of breast cancer.
We're working on what?
Triclosan.
Oh, triclosan. Oh, really?
So he has an entire program working on that in the context of breast cancer. And also the possibility of going from mothers to children. So it's part of the super fund for that is supported from Department of Defense, I believe. So you may want to talk to him. And the second one is regarding the potential environmental context of or exposure to leading to cancer in early onset. Probably you know that Ludmil Alexandrov at the Cancer Center, he's driving this pre-malignancy program. And he's the person who developed all of the mutational signatures for probably all of the cancers. If there is a component that is in the environment, I'm sure he can find it. So if you have the tissues, I would strongly suggest you talk to Ludmil, or he can talk to you, of course.
Okay. This is
Ludmil Alexandrov.
Okay, okay. Well,
he's at the Cancer Center.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Other questions here? Go ahead.
Yeah, but just a quick question. You mentioned 45. You know,
for screening?
Age screen.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I was wondering, why not 40?
So why keep going? So I'm not the cost benefit person, but there's a cost to society. So when these decisions and recommendations are usually done, there's analysis by U.S. Preventive Services Task Force, and then usually one of my good friends, Yuri Lauterbach, has done a lot of work with this. And if why not screen at 20 or 21? But then there's a huge cost to society. So you want to make it still cost effective while you're having the maximum benefit. So there's probably some point at some age, unless cancers started getting really high at age 20. And when I showed you that group, the age groups, so 45 to 49 were the next biggest group with a higher per 100,000 rates. When you start getting to 30 and 35-year-olds, and the rates are actually lower, even though they're going up, but they're not to the levels of 45 and 49. So it's a cost-benefit ratio for society. So you can do MRIs for everyone and screen for all kinds of cancer, but there's a cost to that. Mm-hmm. Right. Right. Well, so this is why it was driving the guidelines now, because of that increase going up. So my point, so 45 was picked because that's the biggest group, and there's still a cost benefit for that. Ready?
Go ahead.
John, sorry.
Go ahead.
I've been waiting to ask somebody, it either was going to be Samir or today you're here, that this October NEJM article, which widely the press picked up on the wrong tone with all sorts of things.
Yep.
One thing that struck me when I was reading it was the number needed to treat to save one was 455 patients, let's say, and Nordic. So what was missing there is syrup. They actually have beet syrup. High fructose corn syrup is banned in all those countries. Is that the connection, or did I miss?
Oh, I don't know. That screen has some other problems with it too. So first of all, it's a European group where they don't usually do colonoscopy. We use a lot of colonoscopy. You can argue whether that's right or wrong. Second, their intention to treat group only had 40% success rate in getting the colonoscopy, and that seems very low compared to their non-colonoscopy group. And so when you look at the numbers, if you look at the numbers of the people who got colonoscopy, they actually improve colon cancer survival and detection by 50%. So, but when you add the other 60% that didn't get the colonoscopy, even though it was intention to treat, their numbers look a lot lower. So you have to watch that carefully. Now, is it diet that's driving their rate? So I don't remember if they had the actual rates of colon cancer for the population in that article, but that could be something. So some of the Nordic countries are slightly lower than some of the Southern European countries, if you will, maybe because they're more on a fish diet, I don't know. But that could be, these are hypotheses, right? So it could be a possibility. But someone have to do a study. That's going to be an expensive study, though. Steve?
John, is it to look at the earlier age groups, would a FIT be cost effective? That's one question. But the other I was going to ask you, is it time for a large scale fecal transplant study?
Not for colon cancer. For C. diff, it still works very well, and people have tried it for IBD, and that's plus minus. But when the recommendations dropped to 45, there was no specific modality mandated for that. But we know FIT works very well. There's now FIT with DNA markers. There's colonoscopy. And there's some other modalities that are still deemed cost effective. So I think FIT or FIT with DNA, although FIT with DNA is much more expensive modality, FIT would be a fine marker. And in fact, the data I showed you from Kaiser on getting rid of the disparities was all a FIT-based program. So that would be fine. Now, in the United States, we push colonoscopies a lot more. It drives dollars. It's diagnostic and therapeutic. Has some slight risk to it, but that's been the mantra in the United States more than any other country. And so most people push colonoscopies in this country. And I don't know how it is. I haven't talked to all the GI people here, what's their backlog. But I know at Michigan, we have a big backlog of people trying to get in. And it's been clogged up by these 45 to 49-year-olds. And then some of the people who have a FIT positive or one of these multi-target stool test positive, it's hard for them to get in. And so we got to have a mechanism to get them in. So I think FIT would be a fine strategy to screen that many people. There's not enough gastroenterologists in the country to handle that volume, at least not right now.
Do we have some questions on Zoom? I don't want to ignore those people. From Don Rubin, the microbiome is selected in part by diet. Does being born by C-section modulate or enhance risk associated with risky dietary indiscretion in later life?
That's a good question. Maybe some of the microbiome people can answer that. But I do know that there's a difference in the kid microbiome if you're born by C-section versus vaginal delivery. I don't know how long that lasts, and I have no idea the relation of C-sections to the risk of colon cancer. At least not off the top of my head. I don't know if anyone else knows that. Okay. I'm sorry? Okay. But we don't know anything about future cancers or anything. Okay.
So from Justin Jaco, in what ways are physicians of today capturing data related to CRC prevention and using that data to impact behavior change in patients, e.g. beyond just screening?
So behavior change in patients. Well, that's a somewhat tricky question to answer because patients usually work with their, in most cases, primary care physicians on behavior changes. And I can just tell you that there are a certain percent of the population that might be motivated to lose weight or change their diet or whatever, but keep in mind it's a lifetime thing. And then there are some that do it for a while and then revert back, and then, and then there's a group that it's very hard to change. And so if in a perfect world, and someone like Dr. Gupta works on this, in a perfect world, we could change everyone's diet and probably reduce colon cancer, but it's going to have to be something that's long term. But in a real world, the thing that we have the most direct effect is our screening. And that's how we're going to change it, I think, from the medical side, unless someone has a great idea to change everyone's diet around the world. We can all go on a rural African diet and for the next 40 years and probably reduce it.
Well, that would affect a lot more than just colon cancer, right?
Yes.
And
get rid of the high fructose corn syrup too.
Right. From Tom Savides, can you comment when the disproportionate increase in early onset rectal versus right colon cancer in age less than 40? I think the question is when does that happen? When
you mean age-wise or birth cohort or? So I'll try to see if I can get that included. So as I mentioned, it's an age cohort. It's been largely rectal and low sigmoid. It's not exclusively, but that's the majority, probably 80–85% have been rectal or low sigmoid for these early onsets. And we see people in 28 to 50. I think I haven't seen anyone, at least I haven't, maybe someone here hasn't seen like a 22-year-old come in, but I've seen as early as 28 to 30. I think we see it in their 30s, 35s, 42s, and many of them without any family history. So I would say, to someone else's point, why not screen earlier? It's just the volume and cost effectiveness. So yeah, could we move to age 20? Sure. It'll just clog up more of the GIs, and unless you do a non-invasive way to do it. But there's a cost to that as well.
I know we're over time, but use chair's prerogative because there's so much interest in this to keep going with questions if you're okay with it.
Totally up to you.
Feel free to leave if you have to. Yeah, go ahead.
Dr. Lumba.
Thank you, John. Great to have you back. Reminded of our days of fellowship. So everything that you presented on early onset colorectal cancer could be really on early onset NASH cirrhosis. All the risk factors are similar. So do you think—
It's bad overall.
Yes. You connected me with Dan O'Connor, and Dan used to tell me from his twin genetics that if something is happening earlier onset, there has to be a genetic component, and on top of it, there is some fuel that is burning the fire. So could it be that there's baseline genetic cancer risk, but there is a baseline genetic protoplasm that determines how you handle these toxins? And based upon that, certain diseases that will be increasing are increasing because your genetic milieu is such not able to handle those toxins appropriately. So it's a lipid handling issue that may be contributing to many of these metabolic diseases, including colorectal cancer.
Well, I think the second part where there's metabolic and handling things, I probably would agree with you. And again, we can't say 100%, but because whatever is happening amongst all these. The genetic component is hard. I mean, so we know what we know. We know 50, 60 genes that can drive colon cancer. None of them have been found in that 80% group that doesn't have a germline mutation, unless something's happening somatically in all these. That's maybe a pre-mutation or there's the right SNP precursors or whatever in this population. So you'd have to surmise if there's something genetic going on, it's not at least a known germline cause that drives colon cancer. So it'd have to be something else, maybe exposure that gives the right mutation and then sets up the right, it'd have to be something like that. Because no one's ever found a germline, at least not in this group. There's young people with germline, of course, but if you separate that out, no one's found a unique gene or anything like that. So I guess it would have to be something unusual.
Okay, so from Diane Massafry, thoughts on screening and other recommendations for first-degree relatives of people with early onset CRC in the absence of a germline variant?
Yes, so our guidelines, and this is true for ACS, the GI guidelines, US Preventive Services Task Force guidelines. Once you have a family history of colon cancer, we start screening those people, and this is irrespective of age. You start screening those people at age 40, so not 45 or 50 before, or 10 years earlier than the early onset. So if someone's 35 and they have a kid now that's like 25, you got to start thinking about that because that's a first-degree relative. Now, whether that's genetic or not is another story, but that's what the guidelines say because we don't know if it's genetic or not. And nowadays, since a lot of people can genetically tested, you can probably eliminate some families but now if there's no genetics, you err on the side of screening those people aggressively. Yeah.
From Barbara Parker, do we have enough data to support personalized screening recommendations in patients with type 2 diabetes and obesity in addition to age?
Personalized recommendations for cancer screening?
Yeah.
None of the society guidelines or US Preventive Services Task Force, they always say average risk. There's no specific call out there's specific call outs for family history, personal history of polyps or cancers, but not metabolic syndrome. So right now they're in a pool of average risk, even though they might be slightly higher risk with obesity and metabolic syndrome, but there's no guideline driver to do them specifically earlier.
So there's a comment here from Rob Knight in response to our earlier question was, for C-section versus vaginal, we see change into adulthood for IBD patients. He has not checked colon cancer, but would love to.
Okay.
Now you've already got 2 collaborations.
Okay.
And I'm going to go with the last question here. And do we have any burning ones in the audience? Okay, last Zoom question. The IL, and this is from Brent Polk, the IL-10 deficient mouse develops colitis-associated cancer in more severe disease with some potential advantage over the DSS model.
Okay.
And he's talking in
Brent would know that.
He's talking in relation to the triclosan exposure studies. Did they report cancer when studied in the IL-10 knockout mouse? Maybe they hadn't do that.
I don't know if they followed it that far, but they didn't report that in the paper. They used the DSS and the IL-10 just to show that it was a chemical or genetic, the triclosan could cause worse. But I don't think they carried it through a cancer in that model. Now, they might have that data, but it wasn't in the paper.
Great. Well, we got through all the questions. Thank you, everybody, for sticking around. Wonderful talk.